Okay, hello everybody. So thank you very much for the invitation for me to participate in today's seminar. I'm really happy that I'm here. Thank you, Jofi. Thank you, Irena, for making this possible. One tiny comment about the title. So I changed one word in the title of my presentation. So I changed transnational into international. And maybe this is something we could talk more about later, because I realized that maybe what my protagonists were doing was rather the involvement in international activities rather than transnational. This word, this concept is something that I'm still thinking about. So I have prepared a presentation about the activities of women who designed and implemented emancipation policies in Poland and around the world after the end of the Second World War. I will talk about how the leftist protagonists of that period, Polish socialists and especially communist women politicians, intellectuals and activists of women's organizations, found their way into post-war reality, shaping and advancing the program of women's emancipation as one of the pillars of socialist modernization. Before I begin, I would like to emphasize that I very much appreciate the efforts of my fellow historians who popularized the history of Polish women and Polish women's movement at the turn of the 20th century and in the interwar period. However, I realize that when we move on to what happened after the end of the Second World War, we realize that the situation of women and especially women's organizations and activists during that period is either ignored or framed in a schematic way. So this question of why this is happening has been bothering me for a long time. In the debate about the history of women in Poland, the post-war period is most often presented as a time of apparent equality. The great educational and professional advancement of Polish women is rarely mentioned, and if it is, then with a number of reservations. It is noted that it was incomplete and above all unfinished. Also silenced is the activity of female politicians, intellectuals and activists committed to designing and implementing the program of socialist modernization, democratization of social relations and emancipation of women. Strategies differ in this case. It is emphasized, for example, that post-war female activists, socialists and especially communists were dependent on the party in their actions and only followed its directives, which is why their achievements are called top-down emancipation, treated with reserve and referred to as apparent. If one attempts to recognize the efforts, it is pointed out that what they did after 1945 was merely a continuation of interwar activities. From this point of view, the People's Republic of Poland, the Communist Poland, has no merit for women's empowerment and functions as a gap between what existed before the Second World War and what came after 1989. However, changes in thinking about the social and cultural processes taking place in post-war Poland are already visible on the horizon, and in some research fields they are quite advanced. They are most strongly evident in historical research. A number of works have appeared in recent years that attempt to look at the post-war period from a different, not strictly political, black and white perspective. And I'm referring here to the publications by historians Małgorzata Fidelis and Natalia Jarska. So here you have a book by Fidelis in English. Natalia Jarska's book, Women of Marble, Working Women in Poland between 1945 and 1960. So these historians comprehensively discuss state socialist Poland's policies toward women in the labor market, identifying emancipatory but also traditionalist solutions in this regard, focusing primarily on the first 15 years after the war. There is also a book by four historians, Katarzyna Stańczak-Wiślicz, Piotr Perkowski, Małgorzata Fidelis and Barbara Klich-Kluczewska. Translated, the title in English would go Women in Poland 1945-1989, Modernity, Equality, Communism. And by the way, I heard that this book is going to be published by the CU Press soon. So we will be able to read also an English version. So this book by these four historians goes beyond the Stalinist period and examines the intersection of emancipatory and traditionalist solutions in the gender politics of state socialist Poland in various areas of social life, in the family, in sexual relations, in attitudes toward the body. There are also works that attempt to look at state socialist Poland and its emancipation policies from a perspective of other disciplines, and this includes the works of anthropologist Agnieszka Mrozik, who examines the development of sexological discourse in Poland in the 1970s and 1980s, and the film scholar Monika Talarczyk-Gubała, who analyzes the activities of socialist realist filmmaker Wanda Jakubowska using new tools and from a new perspective. Finally, by far the latest came publications that attempt to look at the diverse literary output of women after 1945, going beyond its usual interpretations. And I'm referring here not only to my book, which came out in 2022 in Polish. The English title would be Female Architects of the Polish People's Republic, Communist Women Literature and Women's Emancipation in Post-War Poland. And its English version is already under contract with, again, CU Press. So in this book, I examine, among other things, the commitment of communist women writers to emancipation processes after the war. But there is also another red book by literary scholar Katarzyna Szopa, An Explosion of the Imagination, Anna Świerczyńska's Poetry and the Reproduction of Social Life, which brings a new reading of Anna Świerczyńska's poetry through the lens of materialist feminism. Finally, there is a book by sociologist Magdalena Grabowska, Broken Genealogy, Women's Socio-Political Activity After 1945 and the Contemporary Women's Movement, so far in Polish only. So this book tells the story of women politicians and activists who created and implemented emancipatory solutions, working in organizations such as the Women's League or in party units such as the Women's Division of the Polish United Workers' Party. Grabowska argues that professional female politicians submitted projects to improve the situation of women in the labor market, provided opinions on political projects and lobbied for them. The protagonists of her book include Edwarda Orłowska, who in 1946-1953 was chairwoman of the Women's Division, first of the Polish Workers' Party, then of the Polish United Workers' Party. Eugenia Pragierowa, a socialist before the war in the Polish Socialist Party, from 1948 in the Polish United Workers' Party. And between 1946 and 1949, she was the Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Welfare. And finally, Irena Stachelska, this is the first lady from the left, who in 1945-1950 was a chairwoman of the Women's League. So she was the first chairwoman of the post-war Women's League, and this was the biggest, the mass women's organization after the Second World War. My research begins where Grabowska's research ends. That is, I expand the view of women's activism after the war to include those protagonists who were active at the intersection of several fields. So not only women's rights, but also education, science, and culture, and of course politics. For many of my protagonists, women's activism was not in the foreground. Not all of them were active in this field before the war, but for most of them, women's emancipation was part of the socialist modernization program, which they tried to pursue in various fields. So I would like to focus on the activism of my protagonists in three areas: their efforts on behalf of women's education and labor in Poland, and their commitment to the women's cause internationally. As for the education reform project, known immediately after the war as the Third Reform, so following the agrarian reform and nationalization of industry, several names are worth mentioning. Marxist historian Żanna Kormanowa, who was director of the Department of Education Reform at the Ministry of Education from 1945 to 1948. Pre-war school teacher Zofia Dębińska, Deputy Minister of Education from 1951 to 1960. And finally, pre-war doctoral candidate in literary studies, Eugenia Krasowska, who served as deputy minister, first at the Ministry of Education and then at the Ministry of Higher Education from 1946 to 1965. The research shows that access to free public education for children and youth, as well as adults, was one of the priorities of the People's Government during its first period in office. Sociologist Agata Zysiak, who is with us today, and her book in first published in Polish, then the one published in English, the English version, Limiting Privilege, Upward Mobility Within Higher Education in Socialist Poland. So I would like to say that this still is a very important book for me, for my research. So Agata shows how these postulates were implemented in Łódź, where young people from the popular classes were enrolled in the newly established university. Zysiak analyzes the phenomenon of educational advancement in Stalinist Poland, but also the later history of this advancement, including the process of reducing the percentage of rural and working class students, which had already begun in the wave of the thaw after Stalin's death. The protagonists of my research are women who created the education reform project after the war. I realize that today they may not evoke positive connotations, especially in Poland. But in this talk, I would like to highlight their efforts to facilitate access to public education for children, youth, and adults from different social classes. Their efforts aim to eliminate illiteracy, but also to overcome class and gender divisions in access to knowledge. These were important elements of the socialist modernization program. The politicians I have mentioned, Kormanova, Dębińska, Krasowska, were all teachers by training, very well prepared to take on political work in the organization of education. And let me just remind that after the Second World War, some 15 to 18% of Polish society were people who could not read and write or had difficulties with it. So it is hardly surprising that the postulate of universal access to education was, as I mentioned, one of the priorities of the new government. As for the education of girls, the need to educate them in vocational and technical schools, including engineering studies, was emphasized. This project began to break down at some point in the late 60s and early 70s. There were claims that too many women were studying in technical fields, that they were taking away men's seats at universities. It is worth remembering this conservative message. However, this does not change the fact that after the war, women were given the opportunity for education on an unprecedented scale, but also the chance for an academic career, including holding leadership positions in education. So I would say the excellent education of women in Poland is one of the legacies of the communist era. My protagonists, however, headed not only ministries or departments responsible for education. They also headed publishing houses, magazine editorial offices, and libraries. They were everywhere where laws were not only enacted, but also ensured that they become the practice of life. And speaking of emancipation in its historical sense, I refer to the findings of German historian and theorist of historiography, Reinhard Koselleck, who in his inspiring essay, The Limits of Emancipation, made three observations. First, legal emancipation is a necessary but never a sufficient condition for effective equal rights. Second, the legal principle of equal rights for all human beings around the world is proclaimed not only as a legal norm, but practiced as a politically necessary and conscientiously enforced principle of justice for securing our very survival. And finally, no emancipation can merely place individuals on an equal footing. It must always include the interhuman relationships within which people actually live. So what does this all mean? In my opinion, what he says in this essay is that it is not enough just to pass the right regulations. They must also become a practice of life, be known and understood by society, including women. So let me give a few examples. Some of the key laws from the point of view of women and children passed in Poland immediately after the war, that is in late 1945, early 1946, concerned introducing civil marriages, the possibility of obtaining divorces, and equalizing the rights of children born to married and unmarried couples, including by establishing a maintenance obligation. For many years, the women's press, such as the League of Women's magazine Kobieta, Woman, whose editor-in-chief was the writer Janina Broniewska, or the most widely read weekly for women after the war, Przyjaciółka, Girlfriend, headed first by Anna Lanota and then by Halina Koszucka, this is the lady in the center, not only informed women of the rights, but also shaped public opinion regarding the status of unmarried women who were also mothers. If we realize that today more than a quarter of children in Poland are born out of wedlock, which is accepted as a social fact, then 80 years ago, such a phenomenon would have been met with strong stigmatization of women. The protagonists of my research have done a lot to inform Polish women about their rights, but also to eradicate in them the feeling of inferiority, the belief that being a single mother is something shameful. And this belief was particularly strong in Polish Catholic society. Another area in which leftist women writers, publicists, critics, screenwriters were active after the war concerned the position of women in the labor market. The post-war period, especially the Stalinist period with its 6-year plan, opened up access for women to so-called men's jobs, which in public debate began to be called new professions, just to avoid their gender assignment. Many female intellectuals, activists, and politicians made every effort to enable women to work as miners, cranes, steel workers, well paid and prestigious at that time, though of course not only in these professions, because Poland, which was rebuilding from the devastation of war and undergoing hasty industrialization, also needed people working in healthcare, education, and administration. The phrases appearing in the debate about the need to increase women's labor force participation sounded extremely emancipatory. As early as 1946, in a brochure entitled The End of the Kingdom of Saucepans, writer Wanda Żółkiewska encouraged her female readers to enter the labor market more actively. So here is the quote, which you also have on the board. For in addition to the tradition of copper saucepans, the tradition of bitter, bored female slaves, thoughtless or tragic, the traditions of great women, scholars, fighters for freedom and justice, writers, painters, creators of life and culture are known. Another writer, Janina Dziarnowska, wrote in 1952, and here you also have a quote, "Men's work, women's work, that's what people repeated over and over again, what they were taught. A woman too weak to stand at a machine with iron, with steel, but to stand 15 hours non-stop at the bale, she was not too weak. Sacks of flour, of potatoes in the countryside, she could also carry, half bent with a sickle, with a hoe, in the heat. But at the machine, no. Who came up with something like that?" On the other hand, Helena Bobińska, in her children's book, The Pioneers, which was first published in Moscow in 1924 and later reissued in 1951, proclaimed a message that intellectual mother of second-wave feminism, Simone de Beauvoir, would not be ashamed of. So here you have a quote. "It is widely known that dinners are best when girls are on duty in the kitchen, because to them, somehow, the groats never burn and the soup never gets oversalted. But to this, the boys have the argument that cooking is a woman's thing and that they know how to do it from birth, which is of course not true, because a newborn girl is just as incapable of cooking as a just born boy." So if you remember, in her most famous work entitled The Second Sex, which was published first in French in 1949, the French philosopher wrote that no one is born a woman but becomes one. So the Beauvoir and Bobińska drew from the same Marxist tradition, but the Polish writer articulated her thought earlier. Film was also a tool through which new values, new lifestyles, new professions were promoted. Let's take, for example, the 1954 social realist film classic, The Bus Leaves at 6:20, based on a script by Wilhelmina Skulska and also Jan Rybkowski. Its protagonist was a hairdresser who moved from a small town to Silesia, where she took a job as a welder, gained an education and the respect of her community, and finally fix her relationship with her husband. This was the model of modern womanhood of the time. Even if it didn't survive, even if it changed for many women, it was an inspiration. It's enough to cite the memoirs of Anna Walentynovich. I'm sure you heard this name, the famous crane woman from the Gdańsk shipyard whose firing led to mass protests in the summer of 1980 and the establishment of the Solidarity movement. So here is the quote from Walentynovich's memoirs. I remember such a picture, a very popular poster, a girl with a hammer and a saw, smiling and determined, a real worker who together with other workers was building a new, better world. This poster immediately made a very big impression on me. I began to imagine that this was me. Of course, then her story changed a little bit, but this, I think, is a very interesting, I would say, response to the cultural message of the Stalinist and post-Stalinist period. It is worth mentioning that Wilhelmina Skulska, again, this lady, was a journalist and screenwriter of popular productions, not only in Stalinism, but also later. In 1970, together with another man, Jan Laskowski this time, she wrote the script for the 9-episode TV series Dr. Eva, Dr. Eve. Broadcast on Polish public television, the series told the story of a young female doctor who moved from Warsaw to a small town where she treated patients and spread medical knowledge, becoming an advocate for modernizing the Polish countryside. The main character emerged as the embodiment of Polish socialist womanhood, pretty, well-educated, dedicated to her work, but not giving up her private life, relationships with men, and love. As such, she became one of the heroines of the mass imagination in late socialist Poland. For my protagonist, the project of women's emancipation was part of a great social change encompassing all spheres of life. They understood gender inequality as part of social inequality in general, as the result of the intersecting axis of domination and oppression. The social situation of women could not change without changing the situation of other social groups, primarily the popular classes. Therefore, my protagonists participated in implementing systemic solutions similar to contemporary solutions such as quotas. For example, in the field of education, so-called points for origin had been in place since the late 60s. They were one of the tools used to ensure that working class and peasant youth had more equal access to higher education. Quotas were also used to ensure that women were adequately represented on factory councils during the Stalinist period. All of this aimed at effectively implementing emancipation policies. More recent studies of women's movements make a distinction between left feminism or multi-issue feminism, which considers women's inequality as part of a complex pattern of inequality based on social background, age, education, or lack thereof, as opposed to gender-only feminism, which identifies the roots of women's unequal position in the patriarchal organization of society. My protagonists, who would probably disagree with being called left feminists, primarily because they considered feminism as a bourgeois movement, a movement of women from the privileged classes, while they themselves championed the interests of women from the popular classes, the classes subordinated to the power of capital. Anyway, I think that my protagonists are closer to such an understanding of feminism that combines the struggle against women's unequal position in society with the struggle against other inequalities, assuming that these issues should be solved systematically. Now I move on to the last point of my presentation, in which I would like to discuss women's activities for women or for more just societies in the international arena. Polish women were part of a broad socialist feminist front. That is emancipation activities held in the forum of international institutions and organizations. They were active, for example, in the Women's International Democratic Federation, an organization that was founded in Paris just after the war, the Second World War, and carried 4 main slogans on its banners: fighting for women's rights, fighting for children's rights, fighting against fascism, and fighting for peace, which I think are still relevant today. Polish women were particularly involved in WIDF activities during the first period of the organization's history. They participated in the Paris Founding Congress in late 1945. They had representation in its executive committee and in the council, headed the Information and Propaganda Commission, and were extremely active at the women's congresses in Budapest in 1948, where, again, socialist Eugenia Pragierova, the aforementioned Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Welfare, was elected one of the WIDF's vice presidents. They were also active on the Third Congress of Women in Copenhagen in 1953. Another organization, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Culture Organization, UNESCO, which I think I don't need to introduce. Eugenia Krasowska, the aforementioned Deputy Minister of Science and Higher Education, represented Poland in UNESCO from the late 60s to the early 80s. She was chairwoman of the Polish National Commission for UNESCO, as well as a member of the UNESCO Executive Board. As part of her work for the organization, she insisted on guaranteeing women and girls the right to education and access to culture, emphasizing that these were fundamental human rights. In 1975, she called on UNESCO to become more actively involved in celebrating the International Women's Year. Discussing UNESCO's role in the post-war world, she highlighted the political nature of its activities. Access to education and culture itself, the struggle against illiteracy, were, in her view, political issues, as their implementation depended on political conditions in individual countries and regions. Therefore, in her public statements, she did not want to separate the discussion of the right to public and free education from the discussion of the apartheid in South Africa or the situation of Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied territories. And here is a quote, one of the quotes from Eugenia Krasowska. Is it possible to pursue the ideas of broad intellectual cooperation without opposing human rights violations in Chile, South Africa, and Rhodesia, for example? Is it not part of UNESCO's mandate to defend the educational and cultural rights of the Arab population living in Israeli-occupied territories, or to prevent the destruction of the historic character of Jerusalem? End of quote. In addition, it's worth recalling the activities of Polish women in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and the World Peace Council. My protagonists were particularly active in the first institution from its inception. Poland's longest representative on the Commission on the Status of Women was the aforementioned Zofia Dębińska, Deputy Minister of Education, who served on the Commission in 1951 and then continuously from 1954 to 1968. In 1962, she was chairwoman of the Commission, and from 1963 to 1967, she participated in the drafting of the Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in November 1967. According to Franziska de Haan, Dębińska was one of the initiators of the work on the Dido text and co-author of the draft document. She believed that it should be a prelude to the United Nations elaboration and adoption of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which happened in 1979, although without her participation. Another Polish leftist civil servant involved in the work of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women was Fryderyka Kalinowska. This is the second lady from the left. Kalinowska's story is, I would say, my significant finding, which I discussed in my book. So today, Kalinowska is completely forgotten, not only in public debate, but also in scholarly research. This is a real shame, I would say, as she was one of 7 women from around the world who in 1946 became members of the United Nations Subcommission on the Status of Women, and Subcommission was the predecessor of the Commission, which was established a few months later. Participating in the sessions of the United Nations Third Committee on Social, Humanitarian and Cultural Affairs, Kalinowska made a significant contribution to the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the course of developing the document, she emphasized the importance of women's rights issues to the understanding of human rights. It's a pity that the Polish government of the time did not consider accepting the results of her and her colleagues' work. Poland did not sign the document at the time. It did not veto it, but abstained from signing. And a final example, Wanda Tytzner, whom I interviewed last in her life. From 1971 to 1977, Tytzner was the editor-in-chief of Women of the Whole World, the press organ of the Women's International Democratic Federation. From a conversation with her, I learned that Polish women, as part of the division of work among the Federation's member organizations, became responsible for editing the magazine, which in the pre-internet era served as a kind of link between women around the world. Tytzner told me about the huge archive of letters they came to the editorial office of this magazine, located in East Berlin at Unter den Linden 13. Women from all over the world wrote about what was going on in different regions of the world, shared their anxieties, their dreams. When Tytzner's term ended in 1977, she was succeeded by two Polish female journalists, Krystyna Niedzielska and Irena Karska, who served in the journal almost until its end. They served until 1990, and then I think one or two more issues were released. So these few examples show that in the second half of the 20th century, Polish left feminists were very active internationally and not only on women's issues. So what conclusions would I like to propose based on my presentation? First, it is necessary to conduct extensive research on the history of women and the women's movement in the People's Republic of Poland, and I think in other countries of the region as well. Such research is already underway, but there is still much to be done in this area. There is not just a matter of completing the list of missing names and biographies, dates and achievements, but also an attempt to look at the period of state socialism as an integral part of our history and not merely some specific slice of it, which has with no links to the earlier period and to the present. After all, many ideas and initiatives implemented after the war had a longer pre-war history, and the people who pursued the modernization mission after 1945 were formed by the interwar and wartime policies. At the same time, I think that without knowing and understanding the People's Republic of Poland, the socialist Poland, it will be difficult for us to understand many contemporary processes and phenomena, human decisions and choices, or more broadly, our mentality as a society. Second, I consider it crucial to raise methodological questions, including the conceptualization of such terms as emancipation, empowerment, modernization, and agency. It is important to look at how different subjects of women's history, like different women, thought about emancipation, how they understood their own agency. And finally, and this is not only my postulate, but above all that of the new studies of global history, including the global history of women and women's movements, is the need for research to go beyond the national context, to look at the activities of our protagonists, the organizations in which they were active, and the processes in which they participated in a broader inter- and transnational perspective. This provides an opportunity to go beyond the peculiar methodological nationalism that characterizes much of the research on Polish history, and I'm sure not only on Polish history, and which we interestingly need to uphold as researchers, but also as participants in the nation-oriented public debate. Research going beyond methodological nationalism is already underway. What is interesting for me as a scholar working in Poland, but also sad in a way, is that many of the names of Polish leftist female politicians, activists, and intellectuals working for women's rights in the second half of the 20th century now reach us through a circular route, that is, through the work of foreign female researchers. It is they who make us realize that Polish women actively participated in creating an ideologically committed vision of the post-war world, including development a leftist concept of social, political, and cultural order. And here only a few titles of the very recently published books where I could find the names of Polish pro-women activists, politicians, and intellectuals whom I couldn't find in Polish studies on women's issues in Poland. So I would say, and I would like to end with it, that it's high time for Polish scholars to open up to this field of research and mark our place in it more broadly. Thank you very much.